Hi, everybody. Today, I want to discuss what is probably the trickiest punctuation in all of English grammar, punctuating dialogue. It's ridiculous. Periods change into commas, there's question marks and quotation marks, which aren't remotely the same thing, and sometimes the question mark goes before the quotation marks, but sometimes it comes after them. Oh, and that's not even getting into issues with capitalization and complete sentences. Whew. Buckle up, passengers, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. The very first thing you need to know is that dialogue follows the rule of 1 point per paragraph. This means that each time a character acts or speaks and it's a different character, it begins a new paragraph. Look at this example from The Most Dangerous Game, a short story by Richard Connell. Off there to the right, somewhere, is a large island, said Whitney. It's rather a mystery. What island is it? Rainsford asked. The old charts call it Shiptrap Island, Whitney replied. A suggestive name, isn't it? Sailors have a curious dread of the place. I don't know why. Some superstition. Can't see it, remarked Rainsford, trying to peer through the dank tropical night that was palpable as it pressed its thick, warm blackness upon the yacht. You can picture this conversation between these two characters as though it's a scene in a movie. Imagine that there's a camera pointed at each actor. Each time it changes camera shots to focus on the other actor speaking. That's a new paragraph. Now, there are two basic structures that we're going to explore: the type of dialogue tag used and the placement of that tag. We'll start first with type. You're probably most familiar with the verbal tag, which often uses words like said, or asked, or replied. Make sure to keep your tense consistent throughout. I will be using past tense in these examples. Sue said, "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." Luis asked, "How can you be sure where the quotation marks go?" Sue replied, "Random guesses, maybe." Words like these indicate that somebody is speaking. It's not an action that is separate from the words being said. That's why a comma is used to connect the tag to the dialogue. On the other hand, people rarely just talk. They move, they gesture. And even if they're otherwise still, their facial expression may change. These are all actions that are related to what they're saying, but that don't actually make the words come out. Take a look at how actions help us understand how the characters are feeling with the same dialogue from before. Sue scowled at her assignment. "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." Luis shook his head. "How can you be sure where the quotation marks go?" Sue lifted her shoulders in a hopeless shrug. "Random guesses, maybe." Using action tags like these allows the writer to give more detail about what's going on. Notice also that this action is a separate sentence from what's inside the quotation marks. Instead of a comma connecting them to the dialogue, there's a period that separates the action from the dialogue. Some words like laughed or sighed can function both as a verbal tag or as a separate action. How it's punctuated tells you how the word is being used. Take a look at these examples. Sue sighed. "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." In this case, the action is separate from the words. Punctuating dialogue is challenging. But take a look at this next example. Sue sighed, "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." This time, the sigh is actually affecting the sound of the words. There's not a sigh before Sue says this. It's in how she says it. Punctuating dialogue is challenging. That's why there's a comma to connect rather than a period for a break in between. So, to sum up, verbal tags show that something is being said and are connected with a comma. Action tags show what the speaker is doing and are separated from the dialogue with a period because they are a separate sentence. Good job. Take a breath, let it out, roll your shoulders. You got this. Next, let's look at the placement of dialogue tags. This sounds simple. Both action and verbal tags can be placed before the dialogue, after the dialogue, or in the middle of the dialogue. What makes it more challenging is that this affects both the punctuation and the capitalization. Let's start with a simple example. Sue said, "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." So this is a verbal tag placed before the dialogue. Notice that the tag ends with a comma that connects it to the words being said. The space goes after the comma, but before the opening quotation marks. And the statement ends with a period, which goes immediately inside the quotation marks. There's no space between them. Quotation marks, like parentheses, sort of hug what's inside them. It's going to be very, very rare that you have a space after opening quotation marks or before closing quotation marks. Honestly, I can't even think of any examples to provide. If you know of one, you know what to do. Leave me a comment. You can also put the dialogue tag at the end. Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging, Sue said. Notice that now the period inside the closing quotation marks has changed to a comma. Again, this shows that the verbal tag is part of the same sentence as the dialogue it connects to. The period goes at the end of the sentence after the tag. It is also possible to have the dialogue tag interrupt the sentence. This generally indicates a pause or a slight break, so placement is important. This example makes sense. Wow, Sue said, punctuating dialogue is challenging. Notice that there are commas around the verbal tag as it is still part of the same sentence and therefore needs to be connected to it. Pay attention to the spacing. The comma hugs the word before it, and the quotation marks hug what's inside them. The spaces go outside the quotation marks. Period goes at the end, but inside the closing quotes. On the other hand, it looks and sounds weird to put the dialogue tag where there wouldn't normally be a pause in the words the character says. Wow, punctuating, Sue said, dialogue is challenging. Ugh, that is just so offensive. Ugh. I need a sip of water. So let's look at how this changes with an action tag. We already saw an example with an action tag before the dialogue. Sue scowled at her assignment. Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging. So let's look at what happens when we move the tag and put it after the dialogue. Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging. Sue scowled at her assignment. So yeah, not much changes. Like before, the action tag can interrupt a sentence, and like before, this should happen where there's a natural pause or break, but watch what happens to the punctuation. Wow. Sue scowled at her assignment. Punctuating dialogue is challenging. Remember that an action tag is a separate sentence. This means that the dialogue before it and after it is now treated as though they are sentences as well. This brings up an incredibly important point. People don't always speak in complete sentences. To make dialogue sound natural, writers sometimes have characters speak in fragments or run-ons for effect. This is fine. They're basically just treated as though they're statements. Anything outside the dialogue, though, should still follow standard English. Next, let's look at how changing the tag placement affects punctuation when the dialogue is a question, not a statement. Luis asked, "How can you be sure where the quotation marks go?" Remember, a verbal tag before dialogue is connected to the dialogue with a comma. However, moving the tag to the end does not create the same change as it would if the dialogue were a statement. How do you even know where the quotation marks go? Luis asked. Instead of the punctuation inside the closing quotes changing to a comma, it stays as a question mark. The punctuation only changes if it had been a period. Question marks and exclamation points stay the same. However, just like with a statement, when you move the tag to the middle of a question, it only makes sense if you can hear the pause there. How can you be sure, Luis asked, where the quotation marks go? Versus, how can you be sure where the, Luis asked, quotation marks go? No. Why would you do that? Why? It's repulsive. It's loathsome. Don't do this. I will take it as a personal insult and a deliberate attack on my character and integrity as a teacher. Okay, there we go. It's okay. I'm breathing. I'm okay. It's okay. All right. Looking at the same thing using action tags. Pre, Luis shook his head. How can you be sure where the quotation marks go? Post, how can you be sure where the quotation marks go? Luis shook his head. Putting the action tag in the middle is a little tricky because, again, it's as though there's a sentence on either side. So I need to show that effectively the action interrupts the sentence. Here's how I do it. How can you be sure Luis shook his head. Where the quotation marks go? In standard English, the ellipsis means that words have been left out. The way I would read this is that poor Luis is so confused that he can't even finish the sentence at first. He has more to say, but he can't even find the words. He shakes his head, puzzled, and then finally figures out the rest of what he's trying to ask, which is why the second part of the dialogue starts with an ellipsis and a lowercase w in where. However, it's complicated, it's kind of awkward, so I probably wouldn't use this construction. As I've moved the tags around, I've pointed out how the punctuation changes in response. I haven't discussed capitalization much because we've used the names Sue and Luis, and names are always capitalized. However, what if we used common nouns and pronouns? The student said, "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging." Her brother asked, "How can you be sure where the quotation marks go?" She replied, "Random guesses, maybe." One quick detail I want to point out is that we have characters with different genders here. If both characters were male, that third bit of dialogue could apply to either one. Likewise, if Sue were talking to her sister Luisa, the use of pronouns could be confusing. At any rate, when the tag comes at the start of a sentence, the first word is capitalized. However, remember that with verbal tags, the dialogue and tag are connected. "Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging," the student said. "How can you be sure where the quotation marks go?" her brother asked. "Random guesses, maybe," she replied. The same principle follows when the verbal tags interrupt a sentence in the dialogue. "Wow," the student said, "punctuating dialogue is challenging." "How can you be sure?" her brother asked, "where the quotation marks go?" "Random guesses," she replied, "maybe." Since they should be complete sentences on their own, the first word of action tags should always be capitalized. Wow. The student scowled at her assignment. Punctuating dialogue is challenging. How can you be sure where the quotation marks go? Her brother shook his head. One last trick to be aware of. With verbal tags that are after the dialogue or in the middle of it, you can reverse the order of the subject and the verb. Wow, punctuating dialogue is challenging, said Sue. Or, wow, said Sue, punctuating dialogue is challenging. Why can we do this? Heck if I know, English is just confusing that way sometimes. Sorry, I will format the transcript for this video as a PDF and attach a link in the description. It's a lot, and it's complicated. Fortunately, you can find lots of examples to follow in published fiction. And, as with anything else, the best way to improve your skill is to practice. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to leave me a comment with maybe some of your favorite dialogue examples from fiction that you're familiar with. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.